everyone for joining us, and thank you for attending our All About Water convening. We have some great topics, amazing speakers lined up for you. We're going to start off with Jonathan Nelson from the EPA, who's going to talk about technical assistance resources for SRFs, followed by David Wheaton, who's going to touch on realities of consolidation, regionalization, privatization. Richard Diaz with workforce development and securing contracts. And then our very own Anna Bunting from Freshwater Future, touching on disadvantaged community definitions and how environmental justice plays into that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Alice, who, oh, is it Mary? Nope, nope. Victoria. Is Victoria on? Is she still doing our intro for
No,
Jonathan?
you're right. It's Mary Alice.
Is it Mary Alice? Okay. So I'm sorry about that. Mary Alice, who's going to introduce Jonathan Nelson for us from the EPA.
No problem, not a problem at all. And for those that don't know, I am Commissioner Mary Alice Adams for the City of Benton Harbor and founder of Project Need Foundation. And I love this work. And without further ado, Jonathan is a senior advisor for technical assistance and community engagement to U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Water Assistance Administrator, Rahida Fox, the Office of Waterworks, to ensure that drinking water is safe, wastewater is safely returned to the environment, and surface water is properly managed and protected. Prior to joining EPA, Jonathan served as policy director for the Community Water Center. He is a nationally recognized expert on strategies to secure access to safe and affordable drinking water for underserved communities, building resilient drinking water institutions, and growing trust and partnerships with frontline community water leaders. And without further ado, Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mary Alice, and good morning, everyone. I kind of feel like I need to fix that intro. It's nice, but I don't love the word expert. You all are the experts, and we are here to figure out how we can be a good partner and make the progress that we need to make in communities across the country. A little bit about myself. I, like Mary Alice said, I came from a community organization prior to joining EPA. I never thought I'd be at a place like EPA. It's a real privilege to be there. But the work that I was doing before EPA was focused out west, where we had the privilege to partner with communities that frankly had been left behind. Mostly farm worker communities, but a lot of rural and small communities. But I also had the privilege of working with organizations across the country, including I know a few that are on the call today. So it's really a privilege to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about the work we're doing to try to make sure that every community in this country and every family in this country can have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. It is a right. It should not be a privilege. But of course, you all know that we live in a country where not everyone can turn on the tap and have the confidence to know that the water that's coming out is going to be safe for yourself and your family. So thank you again for inviting me to be here. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to breeze through these because I know you've got a full agenda, and I also want to make space if there's questions or you all want to have a conversation. But I will say, Mary Alice, you came in with energy. We feel some real energy right now here in the Office of Water because as our Assistant Administrator for Water, Radhika Fox, likes to say, this is water's moment. I remember a few years back working on an effort to secure $1 billion for water infrastructure. And at that time, it was like, oh my God, $1 billion. Can you believe that? We've got $50 billion for water right now through the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed by President Biden at the very end of 2021. And that is the most funding ever in the history of this country for water. Now, it's not enough to solve every water problem in this country. We've got, as you all know, intergenerational levels of need. But $50 billion is a lot more than no money for water, right? So it can really help us take a step forward. And part of what's making this moment different than past moments is it's not just the amount of money, although that's important, but it's the nature of this funding. A large amount of this funding, almost half of it, is available in the form of grants, or the technical term is forgivable loans, for underserved and disadvantaged communities. And that is really a game changer, because part of the challenge for certainly the communities I was working with, these small farm worker communities, but you face many of the same challenges in Michigan and in the Great Lakes region, is it's not enough just to build the infrastructure, then you've got to make sure it's affordable, right? So the fact that there is more grant and forgivable loan funding means that we can make sure that we're working towards more affordable solutions. And then the last thing, this gets a little more on the technical side, but it's worth saying, we've got 5 years of funding flowing into the states across the country. For those of you that have been in this work, for a bit of time, you know that in the past, we haven't had much time to get dollars out the door. So that's why in the past you've heard things about shovel-ready projects. Well, in our communities, we're often not shovel-ready, right? So with 5 years of funding flowing into the states, that allows us to talk about shovel-worthy projects. So that's important as well. If we go to the next slide, though, when I give this presentation, I have the privilege of meeting with communities, with local electeds and officials, with state leaders across the country. Sometimes I've just spent a lot of time on the challenge statement, but you all don't need a lot of time on the challenge statement, because your communities have challenges, right? Whether it's lead service line concerns, or concerns just about the general quality of your water infrastructure, or families that don't have good infrastructure at all. I want to respect that you already know what the challenge is, but part of what we're working to address is, how do we make sure that communities across the country that don't have the same tools in their toolkit for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's intergenerational disinvestment, whether it's redlining, whether it's any number of factors, there are communities across this country that have the ability to put together a good funding application and compete for federal funding. We at EPA want to make sure that every community has access to the tools you need to be able to go get your fair share of federal water infrastructure funding. And that leads me, if we go to the next slide, to the work that we are starting at EPA, and more than just starting. Over the last year, I think Jill was able to join a meeting with you all maybe last summer, sometime last year. And I'm excited to share that we've made some good progress since then. So our goal at EPA Office of Water is to make sure that every community has these tools in your toolkit so you can get your fair share of funding. So it's tools like helping you be able to identify your water challenges, helping you be able to develop a plan, a roadmap to be able to make progress on your challenges, support to make sure that you've got community voices at the table, and particularly leaning in to identify voices that often, as you all know, aren't at the decision-making table around how we're making decisions around water at the local and state level. Resources to help you build your capacity. The farm worker communities I had the privilege of working with, oftentimes there was no staff in these communities, and we were meeting, in the church or in the school. So helping make sure that we're building the capacity of communities. And finally, brass tacks, helping you put together application materials so that you can get those in to be considered for funding. If we go to the next slide, it's really important for us at the Office of Water to make sure that the work we're doing is rooted in values. It's not enough to just send an engineer or send a consultant, or show up and just talk about what the technical solution is. How we show up is as important as what we do. So we had a saying at the Community Water Center that progress happens at the speed of trust. So we know that the values that we do this work by is very important. So I want to share just a couple of the values with you that are guiding our work. The first is we want to be really focused on underserved communities that may never have even heard of the State Revolving Fund Program. And just for those of you that aren't familiar with the State Revolving Fund Program, every state has basically 2 bank accounts, a drinking water bank account called the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and a wastewater bank account called the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And by law, Congress each year allocates funding to EPA that then goes to each state. And then each state then spends that money on drinking water needs and wastewater needs. Water utilities submit funding applications to the state to get that, to get some of that money. But the challenge is how do we make sure that applications are going in from lots of different kinds of communities to each state, right? That is the trick. And so that's why one of our values is being really focused on underserved communities, particularly those that have never submitted an application for funding to the State Revolving Fund Program. Another value for us that's really important is being proactive. We don't want to wait over the next 4 or 5 years as we're spending this bipartisan infrastructure law money. We don't want to wait for a community to say, hey, you know, I don't know what the State Revolving Fund Program is. Can you help me get my fair share of funding? Because if we do that, if we wait, we may never hear from communities that aren't plugged into this funding. And so that's why we want to be proactive. So part of what we are launching, I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but we're launching an effort across the country to identify hundreds of communities that need assistance. We want to get out of the office. We want to go to communities. So being proactive is really important. And then finally, we want to be community centered. So this is again about recognizing that, you know, many of communities across the country, I'm sure this is going to relate for some of you, you know, you may not have a lot of trust or confidence in government. I grew up in a small rural community. To this day, my parents don't have access to, you know, safe water from their water system. So, you know, this is personal for me, just like it's personal for many of you. So we want to make sure that as we're doing this really important work of helping communities submit funding applications for good water projects, that we're, again, building trust and doing this the right way. All right, a couple more slides. If we go to the next slide. So because there are many different kinds of water challenges across the country, it means we need many different kinds of support for communities. And one of the things that I'll say that's a real privilege in this job is, but it's pretty sobering, is there are many different kinds of water challenges, whether you're in the Great Lakes region, whether you're in the Deep South, whether you're in the Far West, whether you're in the Great Plains, the Eastern Seaboard. There are a lot of water challenges in this country. And that's why when you look at this graphic, you can see that we're going pretty comprehensive when we're talking about the support we want to provide to communities. I'm not going to go through all of these, but one thing I do want to stress for all of you is that this is rooted in, you know, my background. It's rooted in our assistant administrator for water, Radhika Fox's background. Technical expertise is important, but so is community expertise. And technical solutions, technical expertise is something that we're going to really bring to bear as part of this work. We want to make sure that communities that are small, that are rural, that are economically underinvested in, and communities of color, we want to make sure that you have all the technical expertise at your fingertips that more well-resourced communities have. So that's important, but so is community expertise. So that's why when we talk about community engagement and we talk about reaching harder to reach voices in the community, that's really important for us to do this work right. If we go to the next slide, one thing that I want to make sure you all know about is that we recently put online a water TA request form. So this is important for you all to know about because yes, we're going to work on our end to proactively outreach to hundreds of communities, but we also have an opportunity, and this is why, thank you to Jill and to Freshwater for inviting me here. You also have an opportunity to get the word out. So we have a very simple online request form. It's like literally it's the most simple online request form in the federal government. I would put money on that. It takes only a couple minutes. But this is where you can go. And if you know your community has a water challenge, you can put in your information and we will follow up with you and work to get you connected to assistance. So that's important to know about. If we go to the next slide, the last slide will have the website, so you can write that down. Our goal this year is to reach hundreds of communities across the country with assistance. The last thing that I'll just flag is that, and I shared this with Jill right before we started, is that in addition to everything I talked about, which is really focused on how do we solve water challenges in underserved communities across the country, clearly that's important. But what's also important is to be building just the general capacity of communities across the country, including community organizations. So what I'm going to recommend for all of you is that the next time that you have a convening like this, I would like to invite our Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights because they are working on an effort. It's not quite as far along as what I'm talking about, but by later this year, they're going to launch an effort focused on just building the capacity of community organizations. And I think that's going to be something that you all will be very interested in. So if we go to the last slide, this is our website for everything I just talked about, including that online request form. Check it out. There is a email list that you can sign up for, so that way you're getting information. It's really an honor to be able to talk about the work we're doing, but we also know that until every community in this country has safe, affordable drinking water, our work is not done. So we're going to keep working days, nights, weekends, do everything we can in partnership with you to make the progress we need. So with that, happy to see if there's any questions, and thank you all for being here.
Jonathan, that was great. Thank you. And I am going to help out with just fielding questions. And I see Candace Mooshop has her hand raised. So Candace, go ahead.
Good morning, Jonathan. Thank you for that wonderful information. I actually have two questions. My first question, you said that there were two different types of state revolving funds. Can you repeat what they were? And then my second question, you were saying that we should invite the Office of Environmental Justice, and you said a second office, but I didn't catch that one.
Yeah, good questions. And thanks for asking them, Candace. So the first one is about what are those basically two state bank accounts that each state has for water infrastructure. So the first is called the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. The second one is called the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And by clean water, that means wastewater. So Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, Clean Water State Revolving Fund, aka wastewater needs. And I'm happy, Jill, we've got some good information on our website that kind of breaks down what those two are. I'm happy to share that with you if you want to share that out with the folks on the line. And then The other office that I mentioned at EPA is our sister office called the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. So it's actually just one really long name rather than two. So Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And for the freshwater team, I can make sure that you've got a good connect to the right person to talk to there. And that way you can share that out with other folks.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. And I see Alana has put the link to the website in the chat.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to copy it right out of there, you can do that. And then, yes, we're of course happy to share out any materials after this, Jonathan. So we would love that. We had a question about criteria for the definitions of disadvantaged and underserved. We're going to talk quite a bit about that later. So I don't know if you want to touch on that, Jonathan, but we do have another speaker who will get into the details of the state definition.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, because you're gonna have another speaker, I won't go into the details, but the one thing that I will say on that note of what is the definition of disadvantage, and whoever asked that was asking a really good question, and I'm sure some of you know why that question is so important, because part of what informs how states invest, particularly the grant funding that I was talking about, is they're required by law, by Congress, to set a definition for disadvantaged community, and that informs prioritization for that grant funding. So it's a very important discussion. I'm glad you're going to be talking about it today. When I was talking about our water technical assistance, that slide that had all those many different kinds of, it's almost like a buffet menu of, what are the different support that we can provide? We are not restricting that support to any one definition of disadvantaged community. And that's because there are 50 different definitions of disadvantaged communities, because there's 50 different states. So we don't want that to be a barrier. So there was a reason why I was using the language disadvantaged and underserved. Disadvantaged is a term of art defined by Congress and the state. Underserved is whatever we need that to mean. And it's almost like you know it when you see it. You all know what a community looks like that needs assistance, and so do we. So just know that when we're talking about connecting communities to assistance, we're not getting hung up on any one definition. We're going to make sure that communities that need assistance get it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. And I want to encourage people to add questions to the chat if you have them. But we definitely have another chance for another question or two. So if you want to put it in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we'd be happy to give Jonathan a little bit more to talk about. I see we have one here that is, they'd like to know if the PowerPoints will be available. Will that be possible for yours,
Sure.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll send that to all the participants. So no worries there. And then it's, what is the definition of a grant, and will that be enforced? Is principal forgiveness the same as a grant?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's really easy in some of the stuff to get more technical fast than is helpful. So what I would say is that there's really two traditional ways that going back to those two bank accounts, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund, invest in communities. The first is through low interest loans, which is a really powerful tool. It's a much better kind of loan than you can get certainly anywhere else. And in many cases, it's almost zero interest. But we know that for our underserved communities, grant funding is very powerful in terms of being able to work towards having as an affordable solution as possible. And then depending on the state and depending on the nature of the grant, you can think about it in a couple ways. Many states basically provide a loan and then they forgive the loan. So it essentially becomes a grant. but you can also just provide a grant directly. So I'll leave it to that sort of gets into the details. The most important thing for you to know is that there's a lot of grant and principal forgiveness funding that's available. Again, part of the challenge is there's not enough grant principal forgiveness funding to solve every water challenge in this country. It's important to be honest about that. We're going to need to continue, all of you, to speak up for investments in water infrastructure for this country for a long time to come. But $50 billion is still pretty good. It's a lot more than nothing. And that's why it's important for all of you to be sending in your funding application so you can get in line for that. One other thing I just want to share, Jill, is I know that many of you are really focused on engaging with the state in terms of investments. So we are working closely with the state. We're having a lot of conversations with the state. Just one thing for you to be aware of is the state, I don't know if any state folks are going to be speaking today, but the state actually took that online request form that I shared, and they are working to send it out on their end. And so we're going to keep finding opportunities to work together, because that's what we have to do in this moment, is find every opportunity to work with everyone we can. So that's all of you, of course, but that's also our state and local government partners.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And yeah, the memo, one of the things we're doing is going back to the memo that you talked about on one of these sessions quite a while ago, Jonathan, and making sure that the states are kind of following that guidance, or to the extent that we can get there. So yes, we're trying to work with the states as well, and so that's really great to hear. I see that we're about at time. So did you have anything else to add, Jonathan, before we go to our next speaker?
No, just I'll follow up, Jill, with you and the freshwater team on a couple of the resources that help further explain what is a drinking water state revolving fund, what is a clean water state revolving fund. And then we'll encourage the freshwater team to connect with our Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and I can help make sure you've got that contact information. And then just lastly, thanks to all of you for being here. You could be in many different places and many different conversations. So the fact that you're here and showing up, that's how we start making progress. And as you know, information is power. So I'm happy to keep coming back, Jill, and sharing updates and information.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jonathan. We really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I see Mary Ellis has maybe one last statement or question.
Yes, question, and I'm sorry, I had to step away. I had a doctor call come in. My question to Jonathan is, with the 50 billion, does it have anything to do with the decision that Governor Whittemire of Michigan made towards putting some funding towards some water projects? And I think she even named groundwater. I guess I just want, you've given so much information that, oh my, but
I know it can be information overload.
I know.
Yeah.
We here in Benton Harbor are unique. And I guess the main thing I need to know is that I'm glad that the federal government is sending you guys out in the field to hit these communities. I wish that the funding was coming with you so you could be the overseers. As it relates to Benton Harbor is the only one I can speak of. When it comes to applying for these funds, we have been relying on the city engineer, and they are picking projects instead of communicating with the elected officials who hear the complaints from the people. I mean, they've been the engineer for almost 40 some years. And none of this has taken place up until now. And what we don't need is a lot of squandering with the monies. And it's just my desire that the federal government would just send their people out into these communities that they know need the help and send the funding with them to ensure that things are taken care of. And that right there is something that would help to bridge the gap of trust with
Yep.
government and taxpayers, because
Yep.
they are tired of even watching us elected officials fight over little minute things and nothing happens to affect their lives or their quality of life.
Yep. Well, what I'll say, Mary Alice, is that that when we talk about communities across the country where we want to make sure that we're making progress in, you all know who those communities are, and Benton Harbor is one of them. Benton Harbor has actually been a priority for our assistant administrator for water. And as you know, there has been a lot of engagement and there's a lot more work to do. So what I would just say is I'm happy, to follow up directly with you, but Benton Harbor is on our radar. We have been engaged and there's more work to do, as you know well.
Appreciate you, Jonathan. Thank you. And thank you for that invitation.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the assistant administrator for her work and your office's work. We appreciate it, and we will be in touch, and we will reach out to the other office, and we appreciate all the information you've shared. So thank you again. You're welcome, of course, to stay, but if you're unable, we certainly understand. So we'll be in touch in the future, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jill, for fielding those questions. Thank you, Jonathan, for that wealth of information. And thanks to everyone for being engaging in that conversation. Really, really great stuff that came out of that. I'm going to move us right along to our next speaker, who is going to be introduced by one of our very own, Kristen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, who will discuss the realities of consolidation, regionalization, and privatization of our water systems. David Wheaton currently serves as an Economic Justice Policy Fellow at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. David previously served as Advocacy Director at Texas Housers, based in their Austin office. In that position, David supported grassroots leaders across Texas and developed and advanced policies and practices that promote the purpose of the Fair Housing Act. David played a major role in litigation involving federal disaster mitigation funds, where the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Affairs found that the state of Texas discriminated against people of color in their appropriation of federal funds. David was also heavily involved in the Texas state legislature, fighting for more affordable housing and tenants' rights. Before joining Texas Housers, he was a staff attorney and legal fellow at the Capitol Appeals Project and Promise of Justice Initiative, where he helped handle appeals for incarcerated people on death row in Louisiana. Originally from Atlanta, David has a BA in economics from Guilford College and a law degree from Elon University School of Law. Welcome, David, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for that introduction, and thank you for everybody for being here. I'm just going to start off kind of doing a little bit of level setting and also just talking about, I don't have the amazing slides that Jonathan has, but talking about how regionalization and privatization, in particular, those two have really hurt Black communities, and what we can do going forward to try to stop this movement of trying to privatize our water, and also trying to consolidate and do regionalization plans for our water systems, particularly in majority Black-led cities. And so I'm going to talk about, one is regionalization. Regionalization is usually described as when a state entity goes in and then regionalizes a water department, particularly from any type of city, and then uses that city's resources to help give water and fresh water to surrounding counties and other surrounding towns. Privatization could happen in two types, usually, when a water facility can be fully privatized, and there's a private entity that comes and manages and owns the water in that city or town. And then there's something called a public and private partnership, which we see a lot. And that is when the city may still maintain some nominal control over the city asset, the city water asset, but there is a private entity that manages that water and manages the water system and the building system. And so we've seen that happen in a few majority Black cities. I want to talk about some of that. So one, I think a lot of people know is Detroit. And that is when a state appointed emergency manager leased the Detroit regional water and sewer system to a new Great Lake Water Authority. And that is a regionalization system. While the city retained nominal ownership over the system, all major decisions are now made by a 6-member water authority board, and only two of those members are actually from the city of Detroit, which again owned that asset before the emergency manager leased that asset. And so the city lost control over setting rates, project prioritization, and other key decisions. In Birmingham, another majority Black city, after a settlement with the state in 2001, the Attorney General of the state of Alabama now has control over their regional water authority that is now called Birmingham Water Works Board. The Attorney General specifically reserves the right to take whatever actions they deem necessary or advisable to protect the interests of ratepayers during the terms of the agreement. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in Birmingham because there have been massive shutoffs that I'll talk about later, and massive problems with water bill disputes that have disproportionately affected Black residents. And again, the Attorney General has control over rate setting, service, facilities, and equipment issues. In Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority is now overseen by an appointed board of directors, not by the city of Pittsburgh anymore. And in that case, that city and that board unilaterally made the decision to privatize the entire systems management to a new company. And during that deal, there's 23 workers, including water quality staff, that were laid off. And ultimately, the utility violated water quality regulations by switching treatment chemicals to try to save money. And unfortunately, that's what we see a lot in privatization of any industry, is the immediate concern, not for the ratepayers and not for citizens, and not for the people who actually drink the water, but for a company's bottom line. And in Pittsburgh, that definitely had disastrous results. And we know that has also had disastrous results in other places, in the Great Lakes region, in the East Coast, and in the South. And so when we're talking about both regionalization and privatization, I want to talk about them in these three categories. One is the loss of economic power. Two is the loss of what we call Black political power. And then the third is the loss of accountability for city residents and ratepayers. So first, the loss of economic power. And I'm going to use Baltimore, which is currently going through a bill that we are trying to fight that may regionalize their water system. And so with that loss of economic power, I will just do a little case study for Baltimore. Baltimore's water system consists of about $5.4 billion as an asset for the city of Baltimore. It is by far Baltimore's biggest asset. When we looked at Birmingham's water facility was about in 2001, it was about a $1.6 billion asset for the city. In both cases, in Birmingham and possibly in Baltimore, that city asset, that money, that asset that the city can have on their books is now gone. right? That is now leased to a regional authority who now has access to that capital and access to that asset. And so what we see is that there's just a loss of economic power for a city. That goes into like your bond ratings. Can a city get bonds to do better transportation projects, better water infrastructure projects? One of the things that Jonathan talked about was the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And while that is a great bank account, also cities and municipalities can also use their assets to try to go get bonds to do bigger and, you know, more widespread projects as well. And when you lose an asset like that on your books, you no longer get that bond rating, that same bond rating, and that same rate rating to go and do those bigger projects. And then two, we go to the loss of Black political power. What we've been seeing is this regionalization going into majority-led Black cities like in Detroit and Birmingham, Pittsburgh for a little bit, and then Baltimore definitely. These are all cities that have been majority led by Black mayors and Black elected officials for decades now. And we've seen an effort to try to, you know, take away one, a capital asset, and then two, the Black political power of having control over that asset to give it to more rural, to more white communities so that they can have some control over that water system. And so when we see regionalization and privatization, not only is it a loss economically, it's also a loss politically for a lot of our elected Black officials. And then third, and I think the biggest one is the loss of accountability for ratepayers and city residents. And I'm talking specifically about Birmingham. In Birmingham, and just, you know, again, they regionalized their water system in 2001. In 2018, our organization did a study. In Birmingham, 1 out of 8 Birmingham residents have had their water shut off. Right now in Birmingham, there is no big way to do customer complaints, water dispute policies, and that is because the water board, that again is controlled by a state entity, does not want that. They do not want the resident and city voices on the board. Their board, even though Birmingham is a majority Black city, their board is split up evenly between white elected officials and Black elected officials. The city of Birmingham only has a certain amount of votes. And just like we saw that with Detroit, when they created their 6-member board, Detroit as a city only got 2 seats. So they don't have full control over that board, even though the city owned that asset. And so we have seen, unfortunately, a loss of accountability. So in Birmingham, residents are not able to go to that water board and say, you know, can you stop increasing our bills? Or I'm having a water bill dispute. There's no dispute channel for them to go through. And the water board unfortunately does not take citizens' concerns very seriously. And so in Baltimore, I think there has been an effort to try to stop a process like this. So in 2019, city residents in Baltimore adopted ballot question E, which said that it banned the Baltimore water system to become privatized. And then also in 2019, Baltimore passed the Water Affordability and Equity Act, which gave shutoff protections. It had an affordability program and also created a customer advocate's office for customers. And so, which is one of the, you know, I would say one of the biggest and most probably heralded pieces of that legislation is creating a board and an accountability office over the Department of Public Works because there were so many water billing disputes in Baltimore. And so I think, you know, what is happening now in Baltimore is now the state of Maryland is coming in and having state legislation that may preempt those city laws from going in. And we know in Detroit, that is the same thing that happened. Detroit also had city regulations and city protections against privatization, but when the emergency manager leased the system, that was deemed a state action, which preempted those city and local laws and in local charter laws. And so I know I'm running a little bit out of time, but you know, I think we have seen that the racial and economic equity implications of regionalization and privatization have been real. And you know, we also know that regionalization and privatization don't actually help a lot of the concerns when folks kind of bring up regionalization, privatization, say, oh, that is going to help bring more money, is going to help bring more accountability, more transparency. In all of these, the 3 or 4 cities that I've named, there has been less transparency when it's moved to a regional authority. There's been less transparency when it's moved to a public-private partnership. And there's been increased rates, especially in Birmingham and Pittsburgh. There have been increased rates in Detroit as well. And so the problems that the regional authority is supposed to be able to protect from, they have not been able to actually protect ratepayers from. And we've seen drastic racial implications and economic equity implications when folks do move to regionalization policies. And so with that, I will kind of stop and see if there are any questions.
Hi, David. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I don't know. Can you all hear me? Okay.
We can hear you plenty.
I wasn't lighting up green. I have a comment. I'm formerly the Deputy Director and Chief Engineer of Detroit's Water and Sewage Department. So I just wanted to add one nuance to something that you said. The Great Lakes Water Authority relationship, it is a 6-member board. Detroit does have 2 members, but those members have veto power. Specifically, you have to have 5 out of 6 votes to approve GLWA's budget, as well as the hiring of the GLWA CEO, which are the 2 important factors. The 10-year agreement specifies that GLWA shall control their budget within a 4% band, which doesn't always translate to what the utility, not even Detroit, but the other, the other surrounding communities may have to do in terms of rates. And so that's the relationship there is interesting, and it could be slightly different than some of these other cities, but I did just want to add that one little piece. The city of Detroit's Board of Water Commissioners is still responsible for setting the rate, though, for Detroit ratepayers.
I think we understand that plenty, but thank you for that clarification. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Candace, I see we have another question from Candace.
Not so much a question as a comment and observation. So what happened here in Flint was just a little bit differently. At one point, so we're the county seat of Genesee County. At one point, all of the cities or whatever are surrounding us were getting their water from us. And what happened was the Karagandhi Water Authority was, it was birthed. And from that, it took everyone off of being customers from the Flint water source. They tried to move us into a partnership with it, which we ended up going to Gleewood because it just was a better deal for us. And now we do, I believe our new mayor, we kind of use the KWA as part of maybe a backup or mixed water. I'm not quite sure fully what he's doing with that. But when you were talking about how regionalization happens, so here in Flint, when we didn't necessarily fold into that regionalization, they did regionalization around us and kind of, and so it did affect a big asset that we had was our water and those other cities being customers. And it did affect some bonding abilities and everything that happened. So thank you for
that. David, did you want to address any of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a big, like I said, I think that's one of the biggest things is the loss of the economic power of the bonding and setting rates and being able to have that huge capital asset, on your books. And then also, like you said, also, in Baltimore particularly, even though Baltimore only has, about 600,000 residents, the Baltimore water service system services about 1.8 million residents. So when you're talking about, it also services the surrounding county. So when you do a regionalization, the city is now not collecting those funds and not able to use those funds for their city asset. Those are now become regional funds, and they don't actually go to the actual city that has had that regional asset for hundreds and hundreds of years when you're talking about Baltimore. And one other thing I wanted to, address that maybe that I didn't address yet is, a lot of folks will say that privatization and regionalization, again, are going to help increase, investments or protect ratepayers or protect transparency and things like that. And we just haven't seen that. So in Maryland particularly, When looking at there, Jonathan kind of said one of the big buckets of bank accounts was the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And we've done an analysis of Maryland's Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And the loan fund it desperately discriminates against Black Maryland residents. One of the more disturbing statistics that we found is that in 2021, for every percent whiter a jurisdiction was, the jurisdiction received $59,303 more per percent white. In 2022, they received $44,119 per percent whiter. And also, other alarming things when it comes to, per capita spending in that area. For one, there's a county that we just kind of did a compare and contrast to Baltimore City and another county, Allegheny County. Allegheny County has a Black population of only 5,757 folks and only a total population of 67,729 folks. But Allegheny County received $51 million in Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds. Baltimore, that has a total population of 576,000, only received $48 million. So if you look per capita, Allegheny County got $762 per person in Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds compared to only $84 per person for folks in Baltimore. So, I think the real key and the real question is how do we address the systematic discrimination that is going on when it comes to clean water funds and state water funds and drinking water funds, and not addressing this in realms of doing a regionalization process or a privatization process. Like that is going to increase investments. We've seen, especially in Pittsburgh and in other places, it doesn't actually increase any type of investments. Most private entities are just going to protect their bottom line. And so they're going to use cheaper chemicals. They're not going to really care about the ratepayers. They care more about their bottom line because they're a private company. Their fiduciary, responsibility is to their, shareholders and not the actual ratepayers and not the actual citizens who actually get the water.
So important. Those are such important things, and I agree completely, David. And I see Monica Lewis-Patrick from We the People of Detroit has put a report in the chat. Want to make sure everybody sees that and her thoughts about that report. Also, would love to ask maybe one last question, as take my question prerogative here, David, because this is a big issue for Freshwater Future, is really this idea of local control, local governance, and making sure that we retain that in our communities. And so wondered if you have any, you or the NAACP have any thoughts about what priorities we should look at in maintaining local governance as criteria for doing any kind of, say, consolidation or things like that, even where communities might see benefits in that and might want to move toward it. How do we help ensure that the local governance piece is robust and helps them over time?
Yeah, so I would say there's two big factors. One is you want to make sure that the political and the economic power stays within that local government and that local entity. So it could be, if you do want to do a consolidation and there's a board, making sure that that city or that local control has enough seats, has veto power on that board, has the political power to make sure that that board does not do anything that would be against what city residents and what city ratepayers would want, and keeps that local control piece. In Alabama, in Birmingham, that's what's really hurting, because the Attorney General has kind of control over pretty much everything. So even if the board does do something or wants to do a different program, the Attorney General has that final say. So making sure that it's still a local control and that the state can't come in and preempt or do anything that kind of can preempt that local control. And then the second thing is making sure that there are affordability programs and accountability programs baked in and measured in to any type of consolidation plan. So making sure that, I'll speak for Baltimore, for example. So if there is some type of regional governance system, I think advocates on the ground are saying we want to make sure that the things we passed, the Water Affordability and Equity Act that was passed in 2019, which has water protection shutoffs, that stays in that language for a governance, for any type of regional governance. So making sure that city protections that are already there stay with whatever new entity that is created. And I also think that making sure that there's an accountability office that is set up with that regional system or that consolidation system is also key. So making sure that if customers have billing disputes, if customers have any type of other water quality issues, any other type of disputes, that there's an office or an organization already set up that governance model has to adhere to. Because again, in Pittsburgh, when it completely privatized, there was no governance model, there was no accountability measures that city residents could have put on that private company, because again, it was totally privatized. And so making sure that there's still some local control, I think is definitely necessary and key.
That's great, David. Really appreciate that, and would love to even talk further about that with some of our colleagues on this call who are very interested in those issues in the future. So thank you for that answer. I want to give you just a chance to make any last comments or anything, David, as we get close to the end of time. We really appreciate all you've said. It's so important, this perspective that it's really, we're there, we and water systems are there to serve our residents. And so ensuring that that stays at the forefront is so critical.
Yeah, I think that I would just say, in leaving, I think that is really, really key, is to make sure that the ratepayers, and especially our low income ratepayers, are at the heart of any decision that is made. And making sure that local control stays over a local entity or a local asset. And that what we've really been seeing, unfortunately, is, an effort to, and this is happening nationally, to kind of go into some, unfortunately, majority Black cities and privatize and kind of take away capital assets so that these Black cities can't do the type of infrastructure projects that are much, much needed. And so I think I would just end with that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we look forward to continuing to work together.
Definitely, yes. I look forward to working with y'all as well. Thank y'all so much. And I'm going to stay around if that's okay.
Oh, we would appreciate it. Great. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much for getting us, fired up and grounded in the realities of what, these communities are facing. When these plans for consolidation and regionalization are proposed and put into effect, they're very real. So we thank you, David, for that in-depth analysis of what happens. Our next speaker is going to be brought to us by Victoria Long, another phenomenal member of the All About Water team. All to you, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce Richard Diaz. Richard Diaz is the Midwest Regional Field Organizer of Blue Green Alliance. Richard works to engage partners and allies within the Midwest to demonstrate support for advancing an economic recovery focused on manufacturing and infrastructure investments. Being from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Diaz strives to fight for racial and economic justice for Black, brown, and working class people everywhere. Within his 10 years as community organizer, Diaz has been able to help create a Milwaukee neighborhood association, co-found the Coalition on Lead Emergency, increase member participation, and achieve worker-oriented contracts for members of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 998, and help thousands of voters register and get out to vote. So Richard, really excited to have you come talk today. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Victoria. That's a pretty old bio that I wrote like 2+ years ago. It's actually when I first got hired by Blue Green Alliance. So a few things have changed. First, I must give a huge shout out to my most recent heroes, Miss Alexis Smith, who I spent some good time with in DC about a month ago. Her and her mom, Alicia Smith, which are doing great work in Ohio. and also the very strong and courageous leader, Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People of Detroit, who have just taught me so much and just listening in to what they say. So much respect to y'all, and peace to everybody today. It is such a pleasure to be here and an honor to guide you through this very important conversation of how communities of color can access resources through the state revolving fund. Now, when we think of huge wins for the country, like the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure law secured by President Biden and Congress, we must realize that a win in Washington only translates to a win in underserved and historically divested in communities when we push states and cities to ensure equity levers are attached to the funding on the way to communities, and they also continue to invest. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to give a brief background on my organization, Blue Green Alliance. BGA unites labor unions and environmental organizations to solve today's environmental challenges in a way that creates and maintains job quality, building a clean, thriving, and equitable economy. Too often we are asked to choose between jobs and the environment, and our organization works at the federal, state, and sometimes local level to organize around the values of creating good paying union jobs that repair our infrastructure and fight the drastic impacts of climate change. Here on the screen, you'll see some of our national members, unions like the United Association of Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, the UA, the United Auto Workers, the UAW, and the United Steel Workers. Actually, as an employee of Blue Green Alliance, I am represented by United Steel Workers Local 2002. As I mentioned, we also have environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and the League of Conservation Voters. So some really heavy hidden unions and environmental organizations working together to save the planet, put people to work, and pay them a damn good union wage. Next slide, please. Today, we will talk about the resources available through the state revolving fund for lead service line replacement. The bipartisan infrastructure law has set aside $15 billion for the EPA to distribute through formula funds into states' drinking water and revolving fund, much like Mr. Nelson alluded to earlier. And that $15 billion is specifically for lead service line replacement. In 2022, the first year of the 5-year allocation period, $2.9 billion was allocated to states, tribes, and territories for the projects. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund will set aside 49% as grants or principal forgiveness, and the remaining 51% will be used as low-interest loans. There are also other funding opportunities for lead service line replacement or to help mitigate lead in drinking water altogether, like the voluntary school and child care program, lead testing program grant, or competitive programs to help build the workforce to replace lead service lines, like the Innovative Water Infrastructure Workforce Development Program. That program provides support for recruitment and training for the water sector and works to improve water sector employee retention. There are both, a private contracting workforce that we need, and also we need a public sector workforce that can, bid out the work and do the inspections needed to replace lead service lines. Next slide, please. This slide speaks to how dollars will be accessed for governments, and then also how dollars will be accessed for workers and communities. Like I mentioned, there are formula and competitive grant opportunities and also loans available for water utilities. This section on the right here speaks to how communities and everyday people will be able to access the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. So Justice 40, which I think everybody on this call is tuned into, 40% of all federal investments going to underserved and what states deem as disadvantaged communities. And I'm very excited to continue to tune in after this conversation to learn more about the work that folks are doing to define disadvantaged communities in the states. There's also Davis-Bacon prevailing wage, which establishes the requirement for paying the local prevailing wage or market rate for a skilled position. There is Build America, Buy American, which is incredibly important when we talk about jobs being created in our own country. This ensures that materials used to build or repair infrastructure projects are made by American companies that employ an American workforce. So important. When we think about lead service line replacements, there's the McWane ductile iron factory in Ohio that supplies, many contractors with the tools they need to replace lead service lines. That is a unionized USW facility. And, when we increase the demand for lead service line replacement through Build America, Buy America standards, we also create manufacturing jobs. The last is registered apprenticeship and training programs. Now, this helps to train the workforce of tomorrow, making sure that the jobs created from lead service line replacement are training opportunities, and utilizing lead service line replacement as a means to help workers get their feet wet and get some registered apprenticeship training hours on the job. And I'll talk a little bit more about registered apprenticeship and training programs in a bit. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about what goes into lead service line replacement, right? So to replace a lead service line for a single household can take, 6 to 12 hours. It can be done in a day. Most of the time is done in a day. And from a contractor's or business perspective, the entity that's hired to do the work needs to be licensed, insured, and bonded. And this says that a business is capable of doing the work, has insurance in place in case someone is injured on a job, and also is able to pay for any damages that may happen during a project. We're working in a residential space, people's cars are out there, people's homes are there, and, there may be some kind of accident that happens that damages somebody's property, and, a bond can help pay for those damages. The contractor will need to also compete in a competitive bidding process to be awarded work. They will need to do what's called pulling a permit, which means they file paperwork with the city to request a pre and post inspection of the plumbing and electrical work needed to complete a lead service line replacement. Contractors will need equipment needed to perform Contractors will need equipment to perform a lead service line replacement, equipment to perform directional drilling. They will need to do traffic control, erosion control, so water going everywhere. They'll need to do saw cutting, pouring concrete, excavation, installing a new copper service line, and utilizing trenchless technology. They'll need to tape off the water main, install an updated water meter, backfill what was excavated, restore the pavement, restore the curb, the gutters, the walkway, and then also clean up the work site. And to operate the equipment and perform the duties, they will need a well-trained and capable workforce. And, honestly, the hardest part of the job, what I hear from many contractors across the country and many water utilities, is just simply being able to make contact with the property owner. And oftentimes, contractors don't have community engagement experience. So that provides an opportunity for utilities to work with community-based organizations who oftentimes already have those relationships. There are often 4 trades associated with lead service line replacement. There are laborers who perform the basic construction needed on a property or on a lead service line replacement job. There are plumbers who handle the plumbing aspects associated with the jobs. There are electricians for the pre and post electrical inspections needed for a lead service line replacement job. And there are operating engineers who are trained to operate the heavy equipment necessary to do the work. Now, most lead service line jobs are performed by laborer or plumbing signatory contractors, and they enter into different agreements with separate unions to secure the workforce needed. So let's say, I am a laborer. I've went through the 4-year labor apprenticeship program. I've been able to move up in my career mobility, and I have enough capital to start a business. I enter into an agreement with my union. Now, if there's a job like a lead service line replacement that calls for more skilled trades than laborers, like plumbers or electricians or operating engineers to handle the heavy equipment, I would enter into agreements with those other unions so that I can recruit, train, and retain the workforce necessary to do a lead service line replacement job. Next slide, please. Now, lead service line replacement usually requires about $1 million worth of equipment. A backhoe is a huge piece of equipment that is used to dig up the ground and needs to be operated by someone who is, credentialized through the operating engineers training program. And, it's important to note that while I need close to $1 million worth of equipment for this job, oftentimes for a single residence, the job is only worth $10K. In many cities across the country, there's oftentimes a 5 to 10% bid deposit, whereas the work that you are awarded by the city will require you to put down that 5 to 10% of that total contract amount. There also may be a percentage of the work that is meant to be subcontracted out to what's called SWIMBs, small, minority, disadvantaged, and women-owned business enterprises. And that's an important lever when we think about smaller contractors being able to build their portfolio and show that they have a work history and a work plan to be able to secure more jobs in the future. Next slide, please. Now, workforce development is really the precursor and the beginning to someone being a contractor. Now, while technically any rich person can start a construction company and then get into an agreement with the union so that they recruit the necessary workforce required to bid on certain work. There's oftentimes you need a master plumber, you need a master electrician as a part of your workforce. And if you got the money, you can just go to the unions, enter into an agreement, and recruit the master plumber and master electrician from those unions. And again, workforce development is so important because that's how many people begin their career in the trades. Unions play a big role in getting workers ready for these jobs. And even the lowest skilled job on a lead service line replacement job takes 1 to 2 years worth of training. And there are benefits of going union and being trained by a union. Some research put out by our organization states that white male union members earn 17% more in wages compared to their white male non-union workers. Female union workers earn 28% more in wages and compared to non-female union workers. Black union members earn 28% more in wages compared to non-Black union workers, and Latinx union members earn close to 40% more in wages compared to their non-union Latinx workers. And here on the screen, I have, what is a registered apprenticeship program, which I think is extremely important for everyone on this call to know. A registered apprenticeship is a high quality career pathway where employers can develop and prepare their future workforce. Registered apprenticeships are approved and validated by either the U.S. Department of Labor or a state apprenticeship agency or state workforce development agency. Again, it's an employer-driven workforce development opportunity. So you are essentially earning and learning. Somebody brings you on, employs you, and you are on a set time limit. Oftentimes, it's a certain number of hours you need to accumulate on the job. And the only way you can accumulate those hours is if somebody gives you a shot and hires you. It's industry led and you get on the job mentoring. So these are careers that are in demand, which, after this paid work experience, you could land a job basically anywhere in the US that calls for your skills and credentials. The best part about it is the increased career mobility. You get timed raises after a certain amount, substantial raises in some cases, $5 to $10 per hour. And, the career trajectory for a union worker is oftentimes you start off as an apprentice, after a few years, you go to a journeyman who is more of a seasoned veteran. And after that, you go to a master level worker. And, the thing about registered apprenticeship programs is, although there are many folks out there that know the work, may have been raised and working with their family or, just trained up at a young age. And there are certain tests that you need to pass in order to be identified as an apprentice, as a journeyman, and as a master. Next, what is a pre-apprenticeship program? Now, pre-apprenticeship programs prepare job seekers for a registered apprenticeship program or other job opportunities. Unfortunately, pre-apprenticeship programs may or may not be paid depending on who the employer or nonprofit orchestrating the job is. And there are usually pre-apprenticeship programs are usually shorter than registered apprenticeship programs. So, this is a few-year probationary period where you're getting your basic construction skills, learning soft skills, and, just getting exposure to the construction field. Next slide, please. Now, this is the best part of the presentation, which, I'm hoping we can get some good questions around or some good dialogue. I can add my information in the chat because this is really the meat of, how we land people of color and underserved communities in these jobs, and also, help to build workers' career mobility so that they can be contractors and land those jobs. The first and local policy lever, and this is mostly exclusive to, city, municipal, county level levers for policy that it can increase our capacity to get on these jobs. So, first and foremost, we need to fund lead service line work. No city across the country can solely rely on federal funds to get full lead service line replacement, public, private side lead service line replacement, or, replacing every lead service line in a city or municipality. We got to get states, counties, and cities to invest in the programs. Another big barrier is, a cost share to ratepayers. Like I said, many contractors, many cities can't gain access to a home. And, unlike Flint or Benton Harbor or Newark, where, water was different colors and smelling funny and stuff like that, many water utilities across the country don't invest in water testing. And many folks either don't drink the water or just by, intuition thinking that something is unsafe, or they think that, we need to drink bottled water. And, eliminating that cost share helps utilities and contractors gain access so that we can do speedy replacement. Another lever that can be pushed is allowing renters the ability to sign off on their lead service line replacement. You look at the story of Newark, where 70% of the total population was renters. And it's one thing to make contact with who's living in the place, but you got to make contact with who owns the place. So allowing cities and states to pass ordinances that allow renters the ability to sign off on lead service line replacement is so key. Promoting quality contractor standards. Now, this is a big one. So, we got to make sure that Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements are mandatory and spelled out in bids. Oftentimes that are, but you never know. The devil's in the details. So making sure that that is encouraged, that everybody on that job is paid, premium market wages for their work on a lead service line replacement. Also, encouraging cities to award contractors that are certified to train. Some contractors, would complete a job with just journeyman level workers, those seasoned veterans, which, can be a good model. But when you look at, more than half of the plumbing workforce across the country will be retired in the next 10 years. We have to use this as an opportunity to train the future generations and generations of tomorrow. We have to use this opportunity to train Black and brown people because the majority of the plumbing workforce is white. Another important piece is aggregating contracts. So getting cities to bid out voluminous work. Think blocks or communities at a time versus just doing one house at a time. So, the more we can get cities to bid out work, 1,500, a large number of contracts, the more opportunity we have to get Black and brown folks and apprentices on jobs. A contractor is not going to be able to sponsor somebody in an apprenticeship program if they're just doing a few homes each year. Apprenticeship utilization is also really important. So making sure for each skilled trade, for each, electrician, plumber, operating engineer, and laborer, there's a 1-to-1 journeyman to apprenticeship ratio. Now, the laborers are one of the most diverse skilled trades in the country, employing many Latinx, Black and brown, and women in apprenticeship programs. But that's one of 4 skilled trades needed to do a lead service line replacement. Plumbers, majority white, operating engineers, majority white. So we have to require apprenticeship utilization for Department of Public Works projects such as lead service line replacement, and our advocacy around lead service line replacement can increase our ability to get folks hired on more Department of Public Works projects. And then the last one is, local hire and resident preference. This is so important. We talk all day about the communities that have been historically redlined and, have been divested in for over 100 years. But in many places, we don't see cities require that public works contracts or, private contracts that have a ton of city money require that there is a community determined percentage of workers on those jobs. We got to make sure that the folks in the disadvantaged communities are getting that work. And one lever to do that is requiring that each public works contract that goes out has local hire and resident preference. It's best to spell out zip codes and areas where, median income levels are extremely low. Last slide, please. So here's another important aspect in terms of, getting our folks in the queue to be workers and to be contractors. We have to require stronger SWIMBY utilization. I know in the city of Chicago, it's like, 27% of a lead service line job has to be subcontracted out to SWIMBY businesses. In my city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I'm born and raised, it's like 15%. That is a little less than fair at best. So, we have to require that these women-owned, minority, and small business enterprises can take on this work so that they can build their portfolio and someday be able to bid on a project all by themselves, and they can subcontract out to other SWIMBY businesses. Investing in SWIMBY businesses is another huge one. Creating stronger public and philanthropic relationships so that we can boost business development plans for Black, brown, and women-owned businesses. Access to capital is basically what it is. You become a business when you have the money, when you have the credit score, able to get the equipment, to get a good insurance and bond rate, and no better way to invest in Swimbies is to help them get grants for equipment so that they can buy that heavy machinery needed to do the job. And again, financial empowerment to boost credit. Credit score is extremely important in terms of being able to get a loan or to get insurance or bonded. And then this last one that I put big and in bold, we got to put more folks into the trades. We have to. That is the only way for folks to be knowledgeable, to be skilled, and to have that path to upward mobility. And enacting those workforce development policy levers that I mentioned earlier is one of the best ways to do it. So I think I went about 6 minutes over time. So sorry for that. Would definitely welcome any questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Richard, thank you so much. Great information, so needed. We really have to make sure as this money is coming down that our communities are helped. And this is a big place. We want to make sure the contracting goes to local folks, and particularly those who haven't had these opportunities in the past, as you've said. So really important information. We did have a question here from Gwen Winston about what mechanisms could be mandated to track those promises. Are there things out there already used, or do you have thoughts about what could be used?
Yeah, so many cities have their own methodology of how they track data. It's pretty standard. States also do it where they track the amount of apprentices that start a job and then, be able to follow them through their trades career. I want to respond to a comment that I see in the chat from Gary about, there's also a 40% rate of Blacks who don't complete apprenticeships. He is totally right with lack of support being the top reason. If we are going to move people out of poverty and encourage folks to have that access to upward mobility, we have to provide wraparound services. In the same way that, we offer somebody a job and HR makes sure their paperwork is right, to be revolutionary, to be innovative with that, companies would have an HR or another type of staffer who can work with them to talk about, how are you getting to work? You got a plan to get a license? You got a plan to get a car? Would you ever be interested in being a homeowner? And directly from the employer, connecting them with those resources, taking a more case management approach. And, this is all while somebody is getting paid. It's different if I'm doing case management and, I'm doing it to survive. I may or may not follow through with what the case manager is saying. But if my job is pushing that, there's a greater probability of somebody being able to complete the apprenticeship training program.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you. I see we have a question from Mary Alice.
Oh, thank you, Jill. It's just amazing that all of this has come up because over the years, I've watched my husband train these guys, and so many of them right now have lost hope because they go to work, with high spirits and making this good money to turn around and be laid off. And they stay laid off for so long that they feel hopeless. That's no excuse though, but we're actually working on these very things to get training into our schools and starting at an early age of how to utilize things beyond robotics, because somebody is going to have to fix America. Yeah. And because everybody else is getting older. And if we don't give somebody a chance and the paperwork that needs to be kept up with, I think he touched base on that even. I'm just feeling more hopeful now than I was. And I'm so grateful that he was on this call. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Richard. I see we have a question from Candace as well. Go ahead, Candace.
Richard, first of all, thank you for this amazing information. And I know that you've had a lot of time to study and look into and work with the things that you've told us about. So if you could just elaborate a little bit better, because I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can make certain things happen. So like eliminating cost share to ratepayers, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. I'm just wondering, when you have cities that maybe they need that extra help, or they don't have the money to necessarily do it without the cost sharing with ratepayers, what are maybe some steps to help eliminate cost sharing in that way? And then two, when you talked about allowing renters to sign off, which I wholeheartedly agree again, that is something that is a huge impediment when work needs to be done. So would you suggest that maybe there is some language that or maybe there already is language in place and we just don't know, that if the renters are allowed to sign off and something does go wrong, that maybe the landlord can't turn around and maybe take the renter to court for signing off on something like that? How would you move with that model?
Yeah, there are definitely examples out there. I point to the Newark model, in which, they were able to remove 23,000 lead service lines in 6 years. And, passing that ordinance at the local level was really important, so there wouldn't be any, renter retaliation. Landlord retaliation to the renter for signing off on something because the renter doesn't own the property. In my state of Wisconsin, in my city of Milwaukee, we are not able to do that kind of an ordinance because of state statute. So there are folks working now to organize around the state budget and working with legislators at the Capitol to ensure that, we can do some kind of policy lever that allows renters the ability to sign off. It may or may not fly. And that's why community organizing is so important in the whole aspect of moving any policy lever. We have to have voices from across the state talk to their state legislator and be like, we need to change now. We've lost so much from children being poisoned. Instead of us paying for cops to arrest children who had elevated blood lead levels as kids, paying judges, paying bailiffs, paying people to process paperwork, let's save and invest in replacing lead service lines. And one lever to do that is allowing a renter the ability to sign off on if a lead service line can be replaced in their residence.
Thank you, Richard, and great questions, Candace. And I also want to say to your first question, and I'd be happy to hear if Richard agrees, but I think that's part of why we're having this session, is because when we're talking about those local cost shares with ratepayers who are really customers, I don't like the phrase ratepayer, we really want to get these forgivable loans or grants so that, especially in our communities with low incomes and lots of historical burden, we want to get them these dollars that could go to those activities without having to raise rates or get some other kind of cost share. I don't know if you have different thoughts about that part, Richard, but from our perspective, that's a really big piece.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And what else I'm learning is that the principal forgiveness dollars in places that, the city will cover a portion of the private side. Some cities, like my city of Milwaukee, the program is set up so that 2/3 of the cost is eliminated because the city will foot that bill for a ratepayer or a customer, right? And the money that's allocated for principal forgiveness won't actually go to the customer. It will go to pay back the city, thus leaving ratepayers with cost share. So our ability to organize and work to eliminate any type of payment that a ratepayer will have to pay. If my median income level is only $15,000 per year, which nobody can live off of, how do you expect me to pay a $1,700 bill, which would be in the city of Milwaukee, 1/3 of what it costs to replace my lead service line? So yes, elimination of cost share is extremely important. Making sure that we don't, follow what happened in Flint, where, there's this big lead disaster. Next thing you know, we're paying the highest water rates in the country. That's just not fair. And that's penalizing poor people. And in many cases, lead service lines were mandated by the government. So where we can create public-private partnership, and the public sector can't do it all by itself. That's why community organizing to engage philanthropic partners or engage businesses and companies, to give up some of that capital, give up some of that wealth that you gained over the past century, so that we don't have to bear the brunt of lead poisoning and lead exposure. And I'll close on this. I have seen research that says that an investment in being preventative in lead service line or lead poisoning in general, there's a $17 to $1 return on investment. I've seen numbers that say $201 return on investment. So the more we invest in lead exposure prevention, the more we get back as a society. So go tell everybody, go tell that to all your Republican friends who are so concerned about economic security. So thank you again.
Richard, we thank you, and there are a few more questions. I'm afraid I'm going to have to move us on to make sure we get through our whole agenda, but we'll try to link people up so we can continue those questions offline, because it's such a great conversation we're having here. So thank you again, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And I'll go back to Alexis.
Thanks, Jill, and thank you, Richard. It was a great time getting to know you and talk with you during the Great Lakes Day week. We had a fantastic conversation, so I'm looking forward to doing that again. I have the distinct, honor and pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who wanted to make sure that I gave her the best introduction I possibly can. Wanted me to hype her up because she's just that incredible. But Anna Bunny is our next speaker. She's going to bring us a topic focused on disadvantaged communities and definitions, focused around environmental justice. She first joined Freshwater Future as an environmental fellow through Yale School of Environment in summer of 2022. As a program co-director, they're focused on Freshwater Future's water affordability campaign, engaging our network and other policy initiatives. Anna's past work includes community sustainability organization, anti-racism facilitation, environmental justice project coordination, and DEIJ research. They hold a BS in environmental biology and zoology from Michigan State University, and most recently completed their master's in environment and sustainability, specializing in environmental justice and sustainability and development at the University of Michigan. Anna loves to grow food, forage, camp, and play pickleball around in Michigan. She has a sense of humor and a wit that's only rivaled by her sheer dedication and passion for this work. My sister from another mister, Anna Bunting.
Thanks, Alexis. Oh my goodness. My hype man. Okay. So thanks so much to everyone for being here up until now, and for my fellow speakers, because they've covered so much groundwork that has been laid really well for this conversation to happen. And it's going to pull in some of the things that you've already heard today. So we're going to be talking about disadvantaged communities and where they fit into the drinking water SRF. So really, right, our main water infrastructure investment mechanism, how dollars are getting to communities. And we're going to do this by going through the advocacy points that are in each Great Lakes state regarding how disadvantaged communities are currently facing barriers and how they need to be broken down, or how they can be just uplifted in these processes. So if we could go to the next slide, we're going to talk about what disadvantaged communities actually are. Like Jonathan said, we kind of know them when we see them, right? But that's not necessarily the case for governments. They use definitions that are used to identify geographical communities that are considered to be marginalized, underserved, or overburdened by pollutions. And these definitions are different at the federal, state, and local level. So like Jonathan said, there's 50 different definitions for all 50 states. And there's even more beyond that. And that's important because the recent federal legislation that's releasing those $2 trillion over the next 5 years that Jonathan mentioned are going to state and local governments for infrastructure and environmental projects like the drinking water SRF. And they're using these definitions to try and prioritize some of that money. So if we could go to the next slide, there's this other important aspect of the drinking water SRF, and that's scoring systems. So when a community applies to the drinking water SRF, they have this set of scoring criteria that says, you know, maybe your community got a 90 on this scoring system, and then they will be placed on a project priority list. And that's just all of the projects that were submitted that year in a list with their scores, you know, though it'll be descending order of, you know, 90, 80 down. And the amount of funding that is attributed to that project. And the big pot of drinking water SRF, the big bank account, is kind of spent down that list until, you know, no more projects can be funded for that year. So the scoring systems really determine what communities are going to be funded. And each state has its own scoring system and prioritizes different kinds of projects. So it could be a small community is high up on that list, a disadvantaged community, or a regionalization project, which we just heard about the justice impacts of. Next slide, please. And so this really matters because we've got this once in a lifetime amount of funding for water infrastructure, but we have a context of 77% decrease in real water infrastructure dollars being spent from the federal government since the 1970s. So there is a backlog of projects that need to be handled, and we can ensure that these dollars actually go to the communities that need them most, the ones that are overburdened by pollution already, and the ones that are at the front lines of the water affordability crisis. Next slide. So looking at your communities in the drinking water SRF, we asked you before you registered for this program today, has your community applied for drinking water SRF and has it received any of that funding? And we see, you know, some yeses, which is awesome. We see some no's, but we see a lot of I don't know, which is totally fair because it's a pretty opaque process, right? Like, I didn't know until last year that my community had received SRF funding. So a way that you can go about this is definitely reaching out to Freshwater Future. Myself and my colleague Kristen are very focused on drinking water SRF in the Great Lakes states. So just reaching out to us if you want to know that answer is a quick and easy way. But there's two sources of information that you can reach out to. One being that project priority list that I referenced. That's going to be on whatever state agency that you have that runs the drinking water SRF. So likely a Department of Health or Department of Environment are going to have that on their website. And you can, you know, Control F, type in your community name, see if it comes up there, but you might have to go back a couple of years to see, has it been in recent years? That's also a question that your local water vendor supervisor should be able to answer. They should definitely know if they've applied for SRF and if they've received it. But yeah, of course, Freshwater Future is here to help if you want an answer to that question. Next slide, please. And so we're going to talk about the ideal situation, right? Like, what does it look like to have a good disadvantaged communities definition and a good scoring system that actually prioritizes the communities on the ground that need that help? And so we really want a democratic process, if you can believe it, for this program. And how that shakes out is each year is typically a drinking water SRF scoring criteria, their project priority list, and that disadvantaged communities definition will go up for public comment. And I think we're all familiar with public comments. We're used to doing it with permits. It's super important here. And a robust drinking water SRF program will take into account those the inputs of those community members and improve their program. So that's where you can say, you know, I applied last year and my community is disadvantaged, but you aren't recognizing it in this way. Or this scoring system is putting us further down on the list when we shouldn't be devalued in that way. That's your chance to say this needs to be improved. And then also accessibility is a huge issue. Disadvantaged communities need to be able to apply for their projects to even be prioritized in the first place, right? We heard from Jonathan that in small farming communities, that might not be the case. Maybe there's not staff. Freshwater Future works with folks that are volunteers doing this highly technical work to get water infrastructure dollars to their community. So accessibility is a huge issue, and that's where some of that technical assistance that Jonathan was talking about will come in as well. And then historic investments really need to be going to these disadvantaged communities. So we talked about how drinking water SRF funds are mainly distributed in the form of long-term loans, but some grants do exist, that principal forgiveness that we've talked about. And disadvantaged communities need to be prioritized for these grants because they deserve more than just a loan from this. And then we also need to be talking about environmental justice because we know that existing environmental hazards in low-income populations in the community impacts the need for water quality and water affordability. And if we're going to say disadvantaged communities are overburdened with pollution, we need to be looking at pollution. So environmental justice mapping tools can help. And if we can go to the next slide, we're going to continue on with that vein. So most drinking water SRF programs in the Great Lakes states don't include environmental justice in their definitions at all, or their scoring criteria. But we know that environmental hazards are important and need to be recognized as that's a part of overburdened communities. And so what would it look like for drinking water SRF to prioritize environmental justice in your community? If we could go to the next slide. There's a visualization process for this already, right? Like we have a suite of environmental justice mapping tools that are really just a map that can display data that we already have on where environmental hazards are, right? Is there a hazardous waste facility? Is there a concrete plant in your community? Is there indicators of environmental pollution? How is your water quality? How is your air quality? And they combine that with data on health disparities. Is there lead poisoning already in your community? And those things are directly associated with environmental pollutants as well. And then socioeconomic indicators like how many low-income folk are in your community. So the federal EPA has this tool called EJ Screen that has all of those indicators already mapped out on a map of the United States, and can look at each state and say, you know, here's where these indicators fall within the different states. And actually, most Great Lakes states have their own suite of statewide environmental justice screening tools that they're not using. New York is the only state that is currently using an environmental justice screening tool in their disadvantaged communities definition, which we'll talk a little bit more later, but this is kind of a feel for what they'll look like. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through each of the Great Lakes states, but we're going to start with Michigan as a case study, because everything that I just talked about what the ideal is, what we want for disadvantaged communities and scoring criteria really aren't happening in Michigan. And we know a lot of folks are from Michigan, so it's going to be a good place to just kind of lay the groundwork for what are the details of what's good and what's bad. And they're going to apply very much to the rest of the Great Lakes states that I'm going to go through a little bit fast, but at the end we're going to share some resources that'll go into more detail. So no worries there. If you could go to the next slide. So Michigan really needs legislation change when it comes to disadvantaged communities definitions and scoring criteria, because they're currently being reviewed by EGLE, our state environmental agency, annually every 3 years instead of annually. So the EPA recommends that definitions be revised annually, and Michigan is the only Great Lakes state that we know of that's not reviewing each year. And this really becomes problematic because in the last public comment period, EGLE didn't appear to accept any public comments, and change their definitions or scoring from that public comment period. And so there's still many issues with the definition preventing low income and environmental justice communities from being prioritized. For example, the EPA directed states to include environmental justice indicators in their definitions that aren't there presently. So we can see it shaking out right now that not until 2025 will we have a better definition and a better scoring system. And that's simply not democratic. If you go to the next slide, please. So Michigan calls these communities overburdened or significantly overburdened, but overburdened by what? Pollution? That is not being considered currently. We don't have environmental justice in this definition. And we have an environmental justice screening tool in Michigan that's being finalized, and we need to use it. The disadvantaged communities definition uses a kind of a poor statistic for low income being the median household income, which really looks at the household in the middle of all the incomes in a community, which can be really sensitive, especially when there's a large spread of incomes in a community. It can really hide the low income folk that are there. So we want to look explicitly at those low income communities with our metrics, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. There's also not a great statistic that uses an average for water affordability that could definitely be improved, especially since this is all about water affordability. So the scoring also incentivizes regionalization and consolidation, which David did an awesome job of talking about the justice impact. So I'm not going to rehash all of that, but know that the projects that are going to be towards the top of that list that are pushing up are going to be regionalization and consolidation. If you could go to the next slide, please. So some solutions that we see for Michigan that certainly apply to the other states as well. are utilizing that environmental justice screening tool that I talked about, right? Like this tool itself is not an end all be all. It is not perfect. No screening tool is, but that has its own democratic process that can be improved as well. But we need to be considering what environmental hazards, what are the environmental quality aspects of a community if we're going to call them overburdened communities. We also want to improve that socioeconomic metric to focus on low income populations. So looking actually at what are the proportion of the folk in a community that are living at 200% or less the federal poverty level, since that really gets at like who is low income, who needs the help. We also want to be following EPA guidance and following public input for equitable disadvantaged communities and scoring criteria. We want that democratic process in place. And if the federal government tells us we're going to be looking at environmental justice now, we should be looking at environmental justice. We need to be removing the incentives for consolidation and regionalization, but at the very least, there needs to be those good governance practices that are mandated that David was talking about. They're very important, like in terms of accountability and transparency. We also want to be providing additional outreach and technical assistance to disadvantaged communities and small communities. So like John was saying, we can really be making sure that these folks have the capacity to even apply when they're the folks that need it most. Next slide, please. So getting into that idea of small communities, Pennsylvania approaches this from a good way to set the tone. So small communities are less likely to receive drinking water SRF funding. And many states approach this issue by either giving disadvantaged community points to projects in small communities or requiring that disadvantaged communities be a certain size. Under 10,000 people is a common one, but also under 400,000 is a case in New York per se. And that can really leave out important disadvantaged communities like, in Ohio, Toledo is a great example. And so when we talk about small communities, points and requirements in the next few slides, that's what this is referring to. But Pennsylvania acknowledges that the drinking water SRF application itself is a central barrier to actually receiving these funds, and instead actively provides technical assistance and outreach to small communities to bring them into the fold and make sure that they get a good application that's shovel worthy, as John was saying. So in terms of Pennsylvania, they do have their own issues in terms of not mentioning environmental justice in their scoring. And they have an environmental justice screening tool, but it's only really being used for outreach right now. So we want to expand that to the definition and technical assistance as well. Their scoring incentivizes consolidation, and they use median household income. The disadvantaged community definition is a little bit unclear too. Candace, absolutely, we will provide the presentation materials. And yeah, so the definition is a little bit unclear. So you don't know when you apply and you say, yeah, I am a disadvantaged community, where does that leave you on the project priority list? Or do I even know if I'd be considered a disadvantaged community? It needs to be a transparent process. And the disadvantaged community definition uses that kind of nebulous water affordability metric. Next slide, please. So we're looking at New York and Illinois next, and they have some commonalities in these first 2 points. They both use median household income, and they have a small population requirement. For New York, I believe it's under 400,000 folks, so they can kind of exclude New York City from that process. And then the scoring incentivizes consolidation. New York also has this interesting bit where investor-owned utilities can qualify for disadvantaged communities. We have talked about already that privatized utilities come with their own suite of justice issues. They are more likely to have unaffordable rates, and there's this idea of local control, right? So we need that good governance aspects. We know that the residents, when investor-owned utilities receive funds from the state government, that money goes to making sure that residents have affordable and clean water, not investors having more money in their pockets, right? And we do want to make sure that, New York does include environmental justice in their scoring. We know it can happen. They also use their environmental justice screening tool, which needs a little bit of work to it to include more pollution and other stuff. And it's used in their scoring. So that's great. Continuing on with Illinois, they have regionalization is also incentivized in their scoring, and their criteria does not include environmental justice, although they have an environmental justice screening tool that they can use. Next slide, please. So Ohio and Indiana have a ton in common. They both don't mention environmental justice in their scoring, and they don't have environmental justice screening tools. That's where that federal EPA tool can come into play and really serve as something while they don't have their own screening tool. They both use median household income in their definitions, and they have small population requirements. Poor water, they also have poor water affordability metrics for their disadvantaged communities definition. So scoring, and in Ohio specifically, scoring also incentivizes regionalization, and they have privatized water systems qualifying as disadvantaged communities. Next, please. So in Wisconsin and Minnesota, they have some commonalities as well. They don't mention environmental justice and have environmental justice screening tools that they're able to use, but they're choosing not to. They both have poor water affordability metrics that are median household income based. And then when in Wisconsin, there are points for small populations, and scoring incentivizes regionalization and consolidation. In Minnesota, there's kind of an unclear scoring system for applicants. They don't know where they're going to fall on that project priority list. And they have a water infrastructure funding program that provides additional grants to drinking water SRF projects. We need to make sure that disadvantaged communities are at the front lines of or getting that funding first as well. Next slide, please. So to kind of recap what we're looking at, we need a democratic process. We need public comment to really design, to influence the design of these programs. And power concedes nothing without our voice and demanding that we're included in this process. And it needs transparency and clarity. There's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to in this process. And we need to make sure that historic investments are going to these communities, and they need to be, grants, they need to be that principal forgiveness. And this really has to do with how those disadvantaged communities are being defined and being prioritized in the scoring systems. And then lastly, we need to be including environmental justice. If we're going to have these tools that point us to overburdened communities, overburdened by pollution and at the front lines of the water affordability crisis, they need to be used. And we can do this in many ways. And if you go to the next slide, please. We're going to be making sure that we are improving our drinking water SRF programs in the Great Lakes states by monitoring when those public comment periods come up. We're going to be providing materials on what are those details of what's a barrier, what is uplifting disadvantaged communities, so that exactly when this is happening, what it is we need to be commenting on. And so Freshwater Future is going to be there to facilitate those actions and opportunities for you to use your voice. Next slide, please. So one of the resources we're going to provide after this, this week, we're going to be releasing state-by-state drinking water SRF reports. And they're going to go through really these advocacy points with a little bit more detail, so you know exactly what's going on. And when that public comment period comes up, what you're commenting on, what you're concerned about. And if you want to know at all more about disadvantaged communities definitions in each state, this is definitely more important than just the drinking water SRF. These definitions are important for that whole suite of funding that's coming into our states, into our communities. And the Lawyers for Good Government did a deep dive that we'll be able to share with you as well. That's like clickable. You can click on your state, gotta go through who's in charge, all that stuff. And then the EPA and state technical assistance centers and programs that Jonathan was referring to are super important. The EPA has them, the state has them, and those are great resources for getting your application in and all of that. And then of course you can contact me or any of the Freshwater Future staff for any further information or any questions that you have on this. I want to thank you all for listening to this. I'm excited for your questions, and all of this is super people powered. So you all are the experts in your communities. I'm excited to see where this takes us and excited to work together in the future.
All right, thanks, Anna, and happy to take any questions for Anna. I know that was a lot of information because we were trying to get through 8 states in a short amount of time. So we will be, as has been in the chat, we're going to be sending out the summary one-pagers. But also, if you have any specific questions for Anna or Freshwater Future staff about that, you can ask them now, or you can also contact us by email later. So just check in. Any questions while we're all together?
I
All right.
have one.
Oh.
Sorry, I have one.
Debbie, okay.
It's my understanding that water affordability is a Clean Water Act thing for sewage, for example, sewage treatment. And disadvantaged communities is a term used in safe drinking water to apply SRF funds to people who need help with their drinking water. So I know, so my question is, have you seen, or do you think it's okay to kind of mesh the two ideas together to apply it to this new, these new funds for BIL for disadvantaged communities, both on the clean water side, the sewage treatment side, and the drinking water side?
Well, I'll just answer for Freshwater Future in terms of the affordability question. Affordability, it has been defined in some places by the EPA and the United Nations. There are also reports showing different percentages of income that could be used as definitions for affordability. So right now, that field is pretty open. It hasn't been well defined by our elected officials or our agencies. And so there are partnerships. Many of us on this call are working toward statewide affordability in Michigan, for example. But what we want to make sure is if those definitions are used in things like SRF on either side, that we're making sure we're meeting the needs of residents. Sometimes we can just define these terms and then move forward without making sure they're actually meeting those affordability needs. And so we, the people of Detroit, Freshwater Future, have a pledge that talks about a process that came up with 10 and now 11 points of things that people agreed on at the community level that need to be in those things. So to me, it's not as simple as a yes or no. It really is dependent on us as advocates to make sure that all of those important local aspects are moved forward as we clearly define these things. Did you have any follow-up on that, Anna?
No, that sounds right to me.
And I'll just point out that We the People of Detroit has a request for partners to support community environmental justice screening tool there. So if people are interested in that, we want to make sure you see it. All right, I don't see any other questions at this time, and we want to make sure we're moving forward in our agenda. So I'm going to turn it back to Alexis.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Anna. Fantastic presentation and great questions and comments. Yes, please do keep an eye on the chat. There's a lot of great resources cycling through, but we'll also have those available as well as a part of our follow-up materials. Next, we're going to have some special messages that are going to be presented by one of the fiercest water watchers, water warriors that I know. A personal hero of mine, Monica Lewis Patrick, is going to bring us introduce some messages from Rashida Tlaib and Senator Chang. So I will turn it over to her to give a bit of information on that.
Peace and blessings, everyone. And thank you so much, Alexis, for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of the members of All About Water and our guests today. And so just wanted to take an opportunity to sort of queue up the next two, what we consider legislative champions and water warriors. We have one video that is from the Honorable Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who represents the 12th district, but has often been one of the folks that we have been able to go to really lift our concerns around water affordability, accessibility, and also making sure that the federal funds are there through the LIWAP program. And then the second young lady that we want to lift up is one of our water champions here in the state of Michigan, and that's none other than State Senator Stephanie Chang, who ever since she was elected in 2015, coming out of the Detroit bankruptcy, has been a major advocate for clean, safe, and affordable water. And so just looking forward to sharing their own words and their own voice with all of you. So Alexis and the Freshwater team, take it away. Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you, Jill, and all the Freshwater team. Also to all the All About Water partners and leaders and all of our water advocates and guests. You just heard from some of our legislative champions. We hope that all of you will continue to join with all of us to ensure that water is clean, safe, and affordable, and that we usher into this country a human right to water. Thank you so much, Alexis. I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Mama Monica, and thank you for sharing those messages with us. It always just gets me excited to see that we're all so very connected, even with me being in Ohio. And, you know, we're all connected to this work, and we all have a responsibility to make sure that water remains a human right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Candace, who's going to deliver a wrap up of all the amazing information that we heard today, as well as deliver our call to action, because there wouldn't be a need to come together unless we were ready to do some work on top of that. So Candace, take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I just want to, first of all, just thank all of the speakers today for the wonderful information. Thank you, Jonathan, David, Richard, and Anna for all the wonderful information you share with us. Jonathan Nelson from the US EPA talked to us a little bit about water technical assistance and resources for state revolving funds, reminded us that $50 billion in infrastructure funding has been expended, and that the EPA does offer water technical assistance and support for communities. They identify water challenges, develop plans, increase community engagement, build technical, financial, and managerial capacity, develop application materials to access water investment infrastructure. One of the things that he said that I thought was really important was the fact that progress happens at the speed of trust. And so they're trying to build trust with communities so that communities can rapidly progress. And so I really did appreciate that quote from them. They make sure that their approach is targeted, proactive, and community-centered. They're focused on disadvantaged and underserved communities to shift burden and meet communities where they are and build trust by adjusting to needs and being culturally competent. He reminded us that there are 2 state bank accounts. One is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and the other is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is more focused on wastewater. Some of their comprehensive services that are offered in their technical assistance is planning and assessment, project development, partnership and engagement, funding and financing, and program management support. And how can you get access to the water technical assistance? That link was dropped in the comment section, but you can visit epa.gov/water-infrastructure/water-technical-assistance. And once again, that link was shared in the comment section. And they suggested that for our next meeting, we invite the Office of Environmental Justice and External Rights to get a little bit more information about what they do and how they help in the technical assistance aspects. Our next speaker was David Wheaton of the NAACP LDF, and they shared some information with us on the realities of consolidating, regionalization, and privatization. Now, just a few quick steps into those definitions. Regionalization is when a state goes in and uses city resources to provide for surrounding cities, towns, or areas. Privatization is when it is completely, totally privately owned, and consolidation is when the city maintains ownership, but it's managed by a private organization. Consolidation, privatization, regionalization can impact affordability, quality, and people's governance of their water. What it does is it can possibly diminish economic power, communities lose assets, and it can damage ability to get bonds. It diminishes Black political power. Oftentimes when we see the regionalization, privatization, or consolidation happens in predominantly communities that have predominantly color populations, people of color in their populations, and loss of accountability for ratepayers and residents. There's no way for the customers to complain, and it silences residents' voices, and it strips transparency, which are three things that they claim once consolidation happens, that is what it is supposed to do, and it does the exact opposite of those three things. Again, less transparency, increased rates, and regional authorities have not been able to protect from any of the things that they claim that they want to protect from. One of those ways, if you find your municipality heading into regionalization or anyone else, you can make sure that local municipalities keep local control and veto power. You can make sure that affordability and transparency are baked into the programs. Water protection shutoff must also be baked into the program, and then an accountability office is key. So if you find your city or a surrounding city headed toward regionalization in some way, make sure that there is an affordability office, because that is going to be key to help to continue to protect the residents and their interests. Our third speaker, Richard Diaz, from the Blue Green Alliance, he talked about workforce development and securing contracts when we talk about lead service line replacements. Talks about how communities of color and low-income populations access resources from the state revolving funds. The infrastructure bill has set aside $15 billion specifically for the DWSRF and the LSL replacement. 49% will be used as principal forgiveness, and the other 51% will be loans. And able to access those dollars, they can be accessed through grants, which can be formulative or competitive, loans for financing for water utilities. The best way to maximize benefit for workers, communities, and equity is Justice 40. He also talked about the David Beacon prevailing wage, the Build America Buy American, apprenticeship and training programs, which are also very important and very key for workforce development and labor within our communities. And when he talked about what goes into replacing a lead service line, talked a little bit about on the contracting side, when you're talking about bonding and insurance, building on work, and several other things. He also talked about workforce, which would be your laborers, your plumbers, your operators, your electricians. A little bit more information on the lead service line replacement contracting, that it requires at least up to $1 million worth of equipment for a $10,000 a day job. Oftentimes there is 5 to 10% bid deposit, and there may be a percentage meant to bid out. So you definitely want to make sure when we're talking about bidding and workforce development that skilled trades play a huge role in it, and that there are programs such as pre-apprenticeship programs and registered apprenticeship programs that can prepare your community for that workforce development. Talked a little bit about local policy levers for workforce, and in those he included about funding lead service line work, promoting quality contract standards, aggregating contractors, apprenticeship utilization, local hire and residential preferences, requiring stronger small women and minority business enterprises, and also investing in the small women and minority business enterprising. And our final speaker, Anna Bunting, they talked about disadvantaged communities and the drinking water, the DWSRF, and how the definition varies from local, state, and federal entities. The scoring system determines which projects will be prioritized and funded. Each state has its own scoring system and priorities. There are slides that were shown with several different states and their scoring and their priorities, and those will be shared out afterwards. And this matters because we have a once in a lifetime pot of funding. And we also have a huge backup in our system, at least back to the 70s, of funding that needs to go out to the different communities. Improvements are needed in disadvantaged communities. The definition of scoring at the state level needs to be improved as well to ensure federal money is getting to the communities that need them. And they talked a little bit about what makes a good DAC and DWSRF program, and that is prioritizing community input, historic investment, and environmental justice, making sure all of those things are considered. Now, with all of that said, we all have to make sure that we're doing our part as well. So our call to action for today is to, one, keep in mind that this is a historic time with significant federal funds to improve our water systems. So our involvement is needed to make sure it is done equitably. Secondly, we must make sure that we are engaging in improving our state's drinking water SRF to remove barriers and uplift disadvantaged communities by improving disadvantaged community definitions and scoring systems. And of course, Freshwater Future will reach out with future action items and opportunities for us to use our voices as drinking water SRF opens for public comments in the near future in our states. And then also, there were some questions that were posed to each of us, and some of us knew the answer as far as our municipalities were concerned with funding. Others did not know the answer, and some of them we weren't sure either way. And so we want to find out if our communities have applied drinking water SRF funds, SRFs, and ask our elected officials to submit an application if they have not, and to tell them about the technical resources and share our concerns about water system in our community and what needs to be improved. So just thank you for everyone who attended today, and let's make sure we're all doing our part as we heed these calls of actions. And I'll turn it back over to the Freshwater Future team.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Candace. A lot that we covered today, and you wrapped that up beautifully and delivered it along with our call to action. We still have a few minutes left. I just want to take time to thank everyone for attending this session and having such great engagement, great questions. I want to thank the Freshwater Future team, the tech, Alana, doing a fabulous job with sharing the slides and managing the questions, Jill and Ann and the whole entire team, the All About Water Steering Committee, but through, putting together such an incredible, lineup of speakers and just making sure that everything was flowing beautifully. Thank you to the speakers themselves for all the amazing information they shared. I don't want to forget to give our executive director, Jill Ryan, an opportunity to give some closing remarks, but that does bring us to the end of our program. So I will turn it over to you, Jill.
Well, thank you so much, and great job, Alexis, emceeing us through this. It was a great opportunity. I'm so glad for everybody being on today to hear all, excuse me, all the perspectives. I know how busy you are in your lives, and giving 2.5 hours to this topic is really phenomenal. So thank you. We look forward to continuing the work with you, and we just wish you all the best week. So have a great day, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate. Bye-bye.